It's amazing and wonderful to be learning together. What I thought I would do today is to study what we can call perhaps Torat Rabbi Sacks, Zichrono Livracha, on Chanukah. And on the sheets, which, thank you, Shimon. On the sheets, which I'm going to try and share, and again, thank you to Shimon for all of your technical assistance over here, or you'll be able to download. I'll explain why I've picked this particular topic. It's not just because it's coming up to Chanukah and because we're in the period of Shloshim for Rabbi Sacks, but there is, I think, far more to say on this. Now, just at the beginning of the sheets, I'll read and explain. You can see this on the sheets as well. So today, and I hope in some subsequent sessions, we shall explore some of Rabbi Sacks' teachings about Chanukah as we approach the Shloshim since his passing. In particular, we will consider the Torah from the Shiurim, which he shared with his rabbinate during his tenure as chief rabbi. This, I think, is particularly important for two reasons. The first is that he shared it because not only did he want to teach and also to learn, that was very much part of the way that those sessions went, but these were messages which we found to be very helpful in terms of understanding Chanukah and in the approach we took to teaching Chanukah. They were designed to be shared. They were not closed sessions where information was shared, which people were not allowed to tell others. They were very much, here's some teaching, discussion, we're all learning this together. Let's then teach it to people for everyone's benefit. Oh, I see that the sheets are up. Fantastic. Thank you, Shimon. And in addition to that, Chanukah offers a particular opportunity to memorialize Rabbi Sacks and to study his teachings. So in fact, I'm just going to try and scroll up a little bit if I can. You can see over here. Why is this the case? Well, whilst Rabbi Sacks' material on the Chagim, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, as well as the Yamim Noreim, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, is perhaps better known due to his essays and commentaries in his Machzorim, we might be less familiar with his teachings on Chanukah since he didn't write a specific book about this festival. So rather than say we're going to the book he wrote on Pesach, which was his Machzor, I mean, obviously there's much about Pesach in his other writings, but particularly centered around Pesach in his Machzor, there isn't a Machzor, so to speak, on Chanukah. So we have to look, I think, a little more broadly to Rabbi Sacks' library of works, both his printed works and his online works, to try and understand some of the key messages which he taught us about Chanukah. So the first one, which I would like to look at, is Chanukah and inaugurating a better world. And of course, you can possibly see a play on words here. That's one of the most popular translations of Chanukah is inauguration, as in Psalm 30, which we say during Shachar, during our morning prayers, is Moshir Chanukat Habayit, a psalm, a song for the inauguration of the temple, which was written by King David in anticipation, we can imagine, of the temple that would be built by his son, King Solomon. Of course, that's the first temple. Now, as would invariably be the case with Rabbi Sacks, we have to look back in the Torah. I mean, this is not just him, but with almost every teacher I've encountered. We obviously look in the Torah for the source of an idea which we're going to present. And we're going to start by looking at Bamidbar chapter 27. Pretty much the book of Numbers, and you can see from each of the brackets, where the brackets are, those are the verse numbers, and we'll read through and just think about what we can understand over here about Chanukah and inaugurating a better world, particularly from the book of Bamidbar, which was written many hundreds of years before the Chanukah story, of course, given by God to Moshe. And so what does this have to tell us? So the section we have over here is an entire paragraph in the book of Bamidbar. It's not just a section which is taken from the middle. It's paragraph. And here's how it reads. Vaydaber Moshe el Hashem lemor. Moses spoke to God saying. Now, this really is fascinating. I mean, it's a tangent, so we won't get into it. But why do we have Moshe speaking to Hashem as referred to in this way? And what does the word lemor mean? Because the commentators like the Ramban and others explain that the word lemor normally means when God is speaking to Moses, to Moshe, here's some information and tell it to others. Well, if Moshe is speaking to Hashem, why is the word lemor used over here, at least according to that understanding? So I just mentioned that as a question to think about. We won't get into it now, but just to one must always do when reading our texts, to read them carefully and constructively. So then the pasuk says, the verse says, Yivkod Hashem Elokei haruchot lechol basar ish al ha'ida. May God, it seems to be, we would want to say appoint, but the word Yivkod also means to remember. It also means to count, but let's say it means here appoint. Let God, the Lord of all spirits, of all flesh, appoint al ha'ida. And ish here normally means a person, but here perhaps since ish is the most refined kind of person, maybe it means a leader, al ha'ida, on the community. And the community here is referred to as an Eidah because the word aid, it means a witness. Eidah is only one of the words we have for community, but Eidah means a community that is going to witness something. So immediately, you can guess, I hope, what the context is over here. And by the way, at any point, please feel free to remind us that this might come on the us.tv website, or maybe I'll be recorded in a different fashion. I can't be entirely sure now, but if you want to speak or to ask any questions or make any suggestions, please feel free to do so. But the context here seems to be that God is being asked by Moshe to appoint Moshe's successor. Now, this is remarkable because you might think Moshe would want to wait for the call from God, but instead, Moshe takes the initiative and asks God about the appointment of a successor. And the way that God is referred to is also very fascinating. Elokei haruchot lechol basar, a very unusual phrase. And Rashi explains that Moshe is trying to make a point by this terminology to say that this is a leader that needs to relate to all of the people, understand them, and help them with their burdens. So already we're getting a sense of how Moshe might want to build, let's say, a better world, or a world which continues to develop after him, even after he has departed the sea. And then Moshe continues in the third verse, which is Yud Zayin, the third set of brackets. He begins to describe what this leader would do. Asher yetzei lifneihem, who will go out in front of them. Asher yavo lifneihem, and who will come, in parentheses, back before them. Because this might seem to be what kind of leader? Military leader. You might see where we are going a little bit here in terms of Chanukah. Yeah? Or it could just be a leader who leads anyway and is with the people. Someone who is committed to them fully, as Moshe, of course, was.
Here we are.
Va'asher yotziyeh, va'asher yiviyeh, and he will bring them out and will bring them back. It won't just be there for him at the front, but he will look after them. And the congregation of God will not be like a shepherd, that's like a flock, excuse me, that doesn't have a shepherd. Now, the imagery here is very
important. No, he's doing it for you. That's what he's.
Just a second. The ro'eh is a shepherd, of course, is a very important a job when it comes to the Tanakh. When we look at some of our greatest figures, even this week's parasha, we can see about Rachel when Yaakov meets Rachel. Rachel apparently was a ro'ah, was a shepherd, but Yaakov was a shepherd. Abraham, Yitzchak were shepherds. Moshe and David were shepherds. Many of our greatest figures were shepherds. The in his commentary, beginning of chapter 3. So the shepherd is someone who has such patience and such care about his flock that, in a sense, is an ideal training for being a leader of a people, because you have to really put yourself out to care for them and look after them as well. So this is how Moshe begins to scope what his successor should look like. And of course, we know that successor is going to be Yehoshua. Okay? But that's not been revealed to us yet. We know because we've read this before. But it's important that the people have a leader who is going to have the care of a shepherd. So Hashem now replies, verse 18, again the fourth set of brackets, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe. Hashem says to Moshe, Kach lecha et Yehoshua bin Nun. Take for yourself, and it's very interesting, the language, think about others, similar forms of language in the Torah, Lech lecha, go for yourself. Rashi says for your benefit in Lech lecha. It's one of the explanations Rashi brings. Kach lecha et Yehoshua bin Nun. Take for yourself Yehoshua bin Nun. Maybe the same thought stream might apply here. Ish asher ruach bo, a person who has ruach, who has a great sense of spirit in him. V'samachta et yadacha alav, and rest your hands upon him. And you can see that ruach here is obviously seems to be relating to the request that Moshe Rabbeinu, although it's the phraseology of Moshe Rabbeinu's request of God being Elohei haruchot l'chol basar. And Rabbi Sacks explained that here we are learning about Malchut HaTorah, about the kingship, so to speak, the leadership through the Torah. And therefore, Moshe needed to show that there was a successor being appointed by public consent. Yeah? And Moshe, as Adon HaNaviim, as the Rambam describes him, as the master of the prophets, was also, of course, the leader of the people. But we'll see in a moment how those two roles might need to diverge, already as we might understand from other sources in the Torah and later on in the Tanakh as well. And of course, this takes us into the Chanukah story as well, because obviously there had to be leadership of the people in the time of the Chanukah story. And we know that the Maccabim, the Maccabees, were the leaders. And they were certainly people that went out before the people and came back and brought the people out and brought the people back. But of course, they were Kohanim. They were the spiritual leaders. They were not the temporal leaders, at least not at that stage in our history. And here, Moshe has to think, and his request to God, what is the bright model that we're going to have over here? So, verse 19, we get some answers to this question. This is the fifth bracket. And you shall establish him, i.e. Yehoshua, lifnei Elazar HaKohen, before Elazar, one of the sons of Aharon, who was the Kohen, and in fact the Kohen Gadol, lifnei kol ha'edah, and in front of all of the community, again the community described in a testimony sense, and you shall charge him, command him about what to do in their eyes, in front of all of them. So what we have here is a very transparent process where Moshe has gone to God with a request. God replies to the request and says what should happen, but also tells the process as well about the importance of making sure that everybody publicly sees how Moshe is inaugurating the successor in Yehoshua, and Yehoshua as the temporal leader, but perhaps here we'll even call him the Navi, because of course that's what he was, will work alongside both Elazar HaKohen and all of the community. And then in verse 20, the sixth bracket, V'natata mehodecha alav, you should give from your glory or your greatness unto him, Lema'an yishma'u kol adat b'nei Israel, in order that all of the Eidah, again, this community of faith, to borrow a phrase from one of Rabbi Sacks' books, his book written for the 125th anniversary of the United Synagogue, which is still the best work, certainly in my view, for what it's worth, the best work available on what the United Synagogue is and what it should be, and one which in our work we strive to put into practice as often as possible. So in order that all of Adat B'nai Israel will listen to presumably what you are doing here and what Yehoshua is going to say. So already we see that Moshe is thinking about the succession. He's thinking about what will be. God gives him a plan as to how to do this. And Moshe has to share with Yehoshua what he is intending to do and share with the rest of the people his glory as well. Okay? So Moshe, in a sense, is not going to be Moshe and remain, so to speak, Moshe as the leader. He must give of himself to Yehoshua. Then verse 21, the seventh bracket, Lifnei Elazar HaKohen Ya'amot, and in front of Elazar the Kohen, Yehoshua shall stand, V'sha'alo b'mishpat ha'urim lifnei Hashem, and he should ask him questions which need guidance or adjudication from God. Al piv yetze'u b'al piv yavo, hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael oto ve'eto v'chol ha'edah. And according to his command, Yehoshua's command, the people will go out and they will come back. Hu v'chol b'nei Yisrael oto v'chol ha'edah. So according to the command which they get, the Urim v'Tumim, the people will go out. So they will, of course, be subservient to God and following God's command. So what we see here is that in terms of leadership and leading a people and leading a new world, which is going to be, so to speak, after the passing of Moshe, this is how Moshe sets everything up. This, you might say, is a paradigm for leadership in a particular sense, and a paradigm for how to have openly transferred leadership and the values that one needs to put into place. Verse 22, the penultimate set of brackets, Vaya'as Moshe kasher tzivah Hashem, and Moshe did as God commanded, tzivah Hashem, or as God commanded him, Vayikach et Yehoshua, and he took Yehoshua, Vaya'amidehu lifnei Elazar HaKohen, lifnei kol ha'edah. And Moshe placed Moshe, Elazar, Elazar Kohen, in his place and in front of all of the community. Job done, it would seem to be. But there's one other thing at the end of this, which is particularly striking. And this is the final part of this section. Vayismoch et yadav alav. Moshe rested his hands on Yehoshua. This is one of the sources for the fact that we call rabbinic ordination semicha, that it's the student, that the teacher is placing his hands on the student. Rabbi Sacks once said to us, I mean, based on other sources, it wasn't an idea solely of his, that not only when the semicha, the resting is being done, is the rabbi putting his hands on the shoulders of the student who is going to become a rabbi. And of course, we don't do this physically these days. Our ordination is different. That was a different kind of ordination in those days. But also, the teacher is leaning, so to speak, on the students, saying that you have a responsibility. This also from Rabbi Shlomo Riskin in a different context, that the student has a responsibility, and the teacher is leaning on the students to say, actually, you have a responsibility to continue the correct traditions and practice of Judaism and to be an exponent in a faithful sense of Judaism, and we're all relying on you. And perhaps Moshe had a similar feeling towards Yehoshua. We are all relying on you. And Moshe commanded Yehoshua about what was going to happen. Kasher diber Hashem b'yad Moshe, as God had spoken through the agency of Moshe. So what we see over here in summary is a question of how Moshe would pass leadership, would inaugurate a better world. And in particular, Moshe's role in doing this is really significant because we are showing how he can share the leadership he has and establish Yehoshua amongst the leadership of the people. Now, how do we put this into practice? So Rabbi Sacks noted in particular that the first chapter of the book of Yehoshua, which of course is the Haftarah that we read on Simchat Torah, talks about Yehoshua 3 times being told by God, Chazak v'yamatz, a language which is built on what is said to Yehoshua in the Torah as well. Be strong and of good courage. Follow what the Torah says, follow what God tells you, and that will help you in your leadership. And it will help you in your leadership in inspiring the people. And was Yehoshua to lead alone? Was that the model of what Jewish leadership should be? Is this how one inaugurates a better world or not? So Rabbi Sacks very famously used a line in the Talmud to explain this particular idea. And if you watch the memorial to Rabbi Sacks on the US TV site last week, you'll see there's a video right at the end where just in 2 or 3 minutes he explains this in greater detail. But I think it's so fundamental that even if you've seen it, I'd like to quote it again in this context. And it's a seemingly innocuous line in the Talmud, but has enormous ramifications. So the Talmud says, and this is at the bottom of page 1, Talmud Bavli Shabbat 23a, Itmar. So a statement was made. This wants to clarify a particular question in halakha. And the discussion is between Rav and Shmuel, 2 of the earlier Amoraim, so after the period of the Mishnah, both living in Babylon. Rav came from the land of Israel to Babylon, brought to Babylonia, brought the teachings of the Mishnah from Eretz Yisrael with him. And normally when there is a dispute between Rav and Shmuel, normally, other than a few exceptional cases, the halacha is like Rav. So Rav says, Rav Amar, Ein madlikin mineh leneh. If you have a Chanukah, imagine the 4th night. Okay? So if you've lit candle number 1 over here, you can't take candle number 1 and use it to light candle number 2. That's one of the reasons we have a shamash. Okay? Why might this be the case? Well, In short, think of what we say in Hanerot Halalu, after we've lit the first candle, that Hanerot Halalu and Achim Ma'adlikim, they are sanctified, and we don't have permission to use them for anything else. Each candle by itself could constitute the mitzvah of candle lighting, because the minimal amount of lighting that needs to take place is one candle. And so therefore, according to Rav, it would seem you can't take candle 1 and use it to light candle 2. However, Shmuel Amar Madlikin, Shmuel says you can. You can absolutely light from one candle to another. And leaving aside the halakhic question, where fascinatingly, the Gemara concludes like Shmuel, one of those few instances where we learn the halakha like Shmuel in opposition to Rav. Leaving aside, for at least for now, the halakhic question of the fact that you can light from one candle to another, what does this mean? And Rabbi Sacks noted as follows. He said that when you have some power and you share it, or something that you can share, in the case of Moshe Rabbeinu, the Hodacha, his own glory and greatness, when you share it with 9 others, let's say, you have 1/10 of your power, but you've got 10 times more influence because of what you've been able to do to help others and to be able to empower them to do things. And Rabbi Sacks understood this also as one of the differences between a Kohen and a Navi. That a Kohen had a role which, particularly as it played out historically in the first temple period, which is very much taken away, or very much hidden away, I should say, from the people. Whereas a Navi, a prophet, who as the Ramban and others explain to us, Rashi particularly explains to us, is a spokesperson for God. A Navi was able to influence and share with others. Whereas the Kohen had power, so to speak, in his role as a Kohen, the Navi, the prophet, didn't have power necessarily, but they were able to spread influence. They were able to spread light to other people. And when they did that, then the words which were spoken by them, obviously inspired by God, and then entered people's ears and hearts, and people put them into practice, the influence spread enormously. The impact spread enormously. And Rabbi Sacks understood this idea of Shmuel's, that Madlikin, as illustrating this point. And he quoted Kierkegaard. We can't leave out such a source as Rabbi Sacks would quote, that when a king dies, power ends, but when a prophet dies, influence does not end. Influence continues to resonate. And of course, we read from the prophets every week in the Haftarah, the influence continues to resonate in that particular way. When Moshe went to Shamayim after 120 years, maybe any power which he had died with him, but his influence certainly continued and continues every single day. And he gave of that influence, he shared it with Yehoshua to help Yehoshua. Rabbi Sacks also noted to us that, wasn't it fascinating that in Martin Luther King's famous speech of his dream, he was dreaming of, he quotes 2 verses from the first chapter of Isaiah, because a way of showing that the influence which a prophet can spread and show even goes to the non-Jewish world. And it's something which is calling out to everyone all over the world. There is a universal sense of this. So what do we do with these particular lessons? So Rabbi Sacks also noted on this, and I haven't put it on the sheet, I don't want to overburden the sheet, that the Midrash notes that when Yehoshua, the Midrash, of course, the rabbinic commentaries on the Torah, telling us what the lessons we need to learn from the Torah rather than the actual meanings of the words. But Moshe, when he gave of his greatness to Yehoshua, was like someone who poured from one vessel to another. But that second vessel was able to spread further out. And this imagery of the vessel in the Midrash is very, I think, very important, because we need to pour of ourselves to another person. They can then be nourished, and they will continue to develop from that particular point. And this could also be why the Rambam notes, again, based on the Talmudic passage pages that we looked at on Shabbat, chapter 22, and the next page as well, that ultimately Shalom is the greatest lesson of Chanukah. And the lighting of the candles is there to help promote Shalom and help to promote goodness for everybody. So in inaugurating a new world, we learn some very important lessons from Chanukah and from the example of Moshe and Yehoshua, that sharing what we have with others increases the goodness in the world, increases the influence of the world, and it doesn't diminish us at the same time. And Rabbi Sacks suggested that one of the great victories, and perhaps the greatest victory of Chanukah, was actually educationally. That afterwards, not immediately, but afterwards, there was a great revitalization of knowledge amongst the Jewish people. The Gemara in Baba Batra talking about Yehoshua ben Gamla and the system of universal education that he set up. Because ultimately, the victory of Chanukah was Madlikin Mineh Leneh. Thank God we were physically saved. And of course, all the other salvations of Chanukah. But long term, Madlikin Mineh Leneh meant that we didn't have a system which perpetuated a certain group of people at the top, let's call them possibly Kohanim in certain settings, who were hidden away from the people and had the greatest sense of education and purpose, but education was there for everybody. And that was inaugurating a better society than had been in place before. Now, looking elsewhere in some of Rabbi Sacks' writings, we see reference to this. In one of his shorter books, which is this one over here, From Optimism to Hope, which is a collection of his thoughts for the day. He gave this one on the 10th of December 2001. And he says that he wants to tell the story of the festival because it tells us something about the post-September 11th world. This is only 3 months after those terrible events, which I'm sure we all remember. And having gone through the story of Chanukah for the BBC listeners, he says what Chanukah tells us is that it isn't always the big events that make a difference in the long run. It's sometimes the small miracle that endures. It won't be a military victory that will change our world. Instead, it will be whether we in the affluent West are willing to share some of our blessings with the 3/4 of humanity who today live in poverty, hunger, and disease. They have so little. We have so much. And it doesn't take much to rescue a life from despair. Military victories are temporary. It's the spiritual achievements that last. The real test of our age will be whether, for those who suffer in the dark places of the world, we can light a candle of hope. And of course, that was a message for everybody, not just for Jews, which came from Chanukah, and I think very much illustrates one of Rabbi Sacks' most important streams of thought on Chanukah. Another of his works, one of my favorites, personally, Future Tense. You see it's tabbed up because I've been able to use it in our publications so much. Rabbi Sacks was always very generous in letting us quote whatever we wanted of his work, as was his office in helping us with that. In the final chapter, which is setting his vision for Jews and Judaism in the global culture, and this was published, at least this edition, was published in 2009. Rabbi Sacks notes, I've argued for a Judaism that has the courage to engage with the world and its challenges. Faith begets confidence, which creates courage. That is how Jews lived in the past and should live in the future. And of course, this really resonates when thinking of Chanukah, the courage of that core of our people who had the faith to want to create and inaugurate a better world afterwards, to not only drive back against the Hellenism and the threats against us, but also to make sure that we did it with faith and created courage in the future. And they drew on this, of course, from Moshe Rabbeinu and Yehoshua ben Nun as well. This is how, I'll repeat, that's how Jews lived in the past and should live in the future. For they are the people of the journey to a distant destination, begun by Abraham, continued by 100 generations of ancestors, and it still beckons. Judaism is faith in the future tense. That's what Moshe, I'd suggest, displayed in the way that he related to Yehoshua through his initial request, through God's response to him, and what Moshe Rabbeinu did afterwards. It's what the Maccabim did at the time of Chanukah as well. Jews were and are still called upon to be the voice of hope in the conversation of humankind. And isn't it amazing? One thinks of the popularity of Chanukah, perhaps in part because it's a relatively easy festival to observe, but the popularity of Chanukah, particularly in recent years, we owe a lot of thanks to this to the Chabad Shlichim who have really brought Chanukah into the open. But Chanukah is a festival which around the world, people can look at the Chanukah lights and also draw the messages which we need to teach the world, not just Jews, but non-Jews as well. And on that basis, looking down at our list of numbers over here, the Covenant Conversation in Tzaver of 2013 gives further background on this distinction between a Kohen and a Navi. We've mentioned the tribute program last week to Rabbi Sacks. But in particular, I'd like to read through a recollection Rabbi Sacks made from 1991. He had been in post as chief rabbi for about 3 months, but thinking particularly about the voice of hope to the world. This is what he says. And you can find it on his website and on his Facebook page as well. Back in 1991, I lit Chanukah candles with Mikhail Gorbachev, who had until earlier that year been the president of the Soviet Union. We'll all recall what that time meant. The, the fall of the Iron Curtain. Amazing. In particular, thanks and gratitude to God that the leader of, or the person being the leader of the Soviet Union, which has imprisoned Jews and tried to crush Judaism, is lighting candles with the chief rabbi. For 70 years, the practice of Judaism had been effectively banned in communist Russia. It was one of the 2 great assaults on our people and faith in the 20th century. The Germans sought to kill Jews, the Russians tried to kill Judaism. Under Stalin, the assault became brutal. Then in 1967, after Israel's victory in the Six-Day War, many Soviet Jews sought to leave Russia and go to Israel. Not only was permission refused, but often the Jews concerned lost their jobs and were imprisoned. Around the world, Jews campaigned for the prisoners. Refuseniks, they were called, to be released and allowed to leave. Eventually, Mikhail Gorbachev realized that the whole Soviet system was unworkable. Communism had brought not freedom and equality, but repression, a police state, and a new hierarchy of power. The irony is, of course, when thinking back to the earliest ideologies of Marxism, how there were not things that were shared in the Soviet Union. The communists had gone in a different direction entirely, completely counter to the lessons of Chanukah. In the end, it collapsed, and Jews regained the freedom to practice Judaism and go to Israel. That day in 1991, after we had lit candles together, Mr. Gorbachev asked me, through his interpreter, what we had just done. I told him that 22 centuries ago in Israel, after the public practice of Judaism had been banned, Jews fought for and won their freedom, and these lights were the symbol of that victory. And I continued, 70 years ago, Jews suffered the same loss of freedom in Russia, and you have now helped them to regain it. So you have become part of the Chanukah story. And as the interpreter translated these words into Russian, Mikhail Gorbachev blushed. The Chanukah story still lives, still inspires, telling not just us but the world that though tyranny exists, freedom, with God's help, will always win the final battle. Rabbi Sacks ended that by saying, Chanukah Sameach. So to summarize, what I hope we've been able to see here are some of the key messages of Chanukah as analyzed by Rabbi Sacks, as he taught his rabbinate, and as he encouraged us, if we wanted to, through the conversations and learning we had with him, to spread to others. And I hope that particularly L'Zecher Nishmato, we've been able to do that faithfully and in the way that he would have wanted us to do. We've seen how the roots of the idea of Chanukah, inaugurating a better world, of shared hope to others, come from at the times of Moshe Rabbeinu and his transition to Yehoshua. We've seen how through the dispute between Rav and Shmuel and the eventual establishing of the halakha like Shmuel, that the sharing and giving of one's greatness, be it a person or a candle, to others, increases the influence which one has. And this is something which resonates, unlike power, which ultimately stops. And we've seen how Rabbi Sacks set this out in his thought for the day, but also in his future tense, which, again, in my view, for what it's worth, is one of his most important works about what it means to be Jewish. And then we've seen, in particular, an example of this, remarkably, with the last leader of the Soviet Union, and how the message of Chanukah, taught in this particular way, even resonated with somebody like him. So I hope you've enjoyed and benefited from these insights. One can never present the words of a master as well as they can, but hopefully we've got the best understanding we can. And I hope we'll have some more opportunities to be able to learn more of the Torah of Rabbi Sacks on Chanukah, and of course his Torah in general at other times. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining in today. Great to see you, great to be with you virtually. I wish you all safe and well, and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.